I'm very happy to be here, and it's a real honor to be here in Lincoln's home, or a home on this to commemorate this very important event. Like Justin said, this is the subject of my book is very much the Civil Rights Act and the making of the bill through the legislative process. But also, I would like to think that the book shines a light on a broader question, which is the question of democracy and the question of racial justice, and how those two things, at least in this instance, came together to produce real progress after over 100 years of more or less injustice, of honor broken, of promises broken, to see Lincoln's promise realized fully in this piece of legislation. And because we're here in Springfield, I thought I'd focus on the president who succeeded him exactly 100 years later, and also shared a certain tragic resonance with President Lincoln, and that is John F. Kennedy. Both of them, I would say, did an immense amount of work, did an immense amount for African Americans. But in recent years, while Lincoln's star, of course, has always shone very brightly, I would say, at least in the academic literature and to some extent just in the popular literature, Kennedy's star with regards to racial progress has started to dim a little. Critics have questioned his commitment to civil rights, his achievements, and they've also highlighted the relationships that he had with Southern Democrats and the concessions he was willing to make in order to maintain those relationships at the expense of racial justice. And all of that's true. I think that Kennedy was hardly the unvarnished hero of civil rights that a lot of his hagiographers made him out to be in the years after his assassination. However, I would contend that he was also not the calculating, indifferent, and ineffective politico that a lot of his recent critics have made him out to be. Indeed, while Kennedy did push civil rights aside during the first years of his administration, which is what critics often focus on, is absolutely true. By 1963, really starting in 1963, he focused on the issue increasingly and with increasing passion. And by his death in November of 1963 was, I would say, the driving force behind the Civil Rights Act, certainly the driving force within the government. And so again, because I'm here in Springfield, and because Justin already mentioned February 12th, let me start with this anecdote about Lincoln Day, February 12th, 1963. Now, traditionally, Lincoln Day was a day when all the GOP congressmen, the Republican congressmen, would take a day or a weekend or a couple of days and go back to their home districts, their home states, and they would talk about what their party had done for civil rights. And they would celebrate President Lincoln. They would celebrate his position as sort of the forefather, more or less, of the Republican Party, and they would use it basically to stump for votes and to celebrate what their party had meant for African Americans. But 1963 was a little different, and Kennedy had a plan this time. Now, Kennedy had run in 1960 for president on a promise of strong civil rights legislation. He had within his platform, and also within the Democratic Party platform, a very strong set of very specific steps that would be taken by the Kennedy administration, if it were elected, to promote civil rights, to fight injustice in the South and nationwide. And that all fell by the wayside after Kennedy was elected, pretty much from the very day. A few weeks after he was elected, some members of Congress who had essentially signed on to be the stump men for that part of the legislation, and to sort of promise that it would be introduced in Congress once Kennedy was in office, came to him and said, okay, we're ready to go, right, on civil rights. And he said, let's wait a little while. And a little while turned into a long while. And even though he took a series of symbolic actions, a series of very high-profile, very low-impact steps, he really made sure that he did nothing to anger his allies among the Southern Democrats. And we can talk about why that is, and I think there are a variety of critical and, let's say, somewhat more forgiving reasons why Kennedy might want to set aside strong legislation. But the fact is that he had promised strong legislation, said to leading civil rights leaders that he would do something, and he didn't. So needless to say, these men, and we're talking about men like Roy Wilkins, who is the head of the national, or the NAACP, Martin Luther King, of course, and as well as local and state leaders that he had met with from the civil rights movement, as well as union leaders, church leaders, synagogue leaders, the whole sort of array of groups that were aligned under the sort of rubric of the civil rights movement, broadly speaking. They were all very unhappy with him. But the African Americans, of course, had a particular edge that they could bring. They had traditionally voted Republican. Kennedy was already starting by the early part of 1963 to think about what was upcoming. He had just come over, they had just passed the 62 midterm elections. He was starting to think about the 64 elections. He was looking at some of his opponents, like maybe Nelson Rockefeller, who was a liberal Republican, maybe might be able to convince African American voters to come back to the GOP. And of course, African Americans had given him, arguably, the edge over Richard Nixon in 1960. Suffice to say that Kennedy was worried. He heard what the civil rights leaders were saying, and he didn't like what they were telling him about the possibility of a return to the other party. Nevertheless, in the fall of 1962, when Martin Luther King came to Kennedy and said, "I have an idea. Why don't you issue a second Emancipation Proclamation? It'll be on the 100th anniversary of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. It will say that we are now ready to take the next step, that we are now going to fulfill a lot of the promises that were made by that generation, that were written in legislation, written in blood in the Civil War, and yet have not quite been realized. Why don't you do that? That would be a great thing for you to do right now." And of course, it's not legislation. It would just be a proclamation. You could do that. And even for that, Kennedy said, "Let me think about it. I don't think I will." And Kennedy soft-shoed even the recognition of the Emancipation Proclamation. He did not want to go too far because, of course, anyone, particularly if you're of a certain age, you know that Lincoln was not a popular guy in the South. And we think of the South as a Republican stronghold today, but even in the 1960s, it was a hardcore Democratic stronghold, and Lincoln was, in death, persona non grata. So Kennedy didn't want to do anything to recognize what Lincoln had done, what certainly he had done for African Americans, and so he was very quiet about it. But as 1962 turned into 1963, Kennedy's advisors started to come to him and say, "Look, we've got to do something. We can't just, maybe you were right on this Emancipation Proclamation. Maybe that was a little too far. But we've got to do something, at least to appeal to these civil rights leaders who have huge constituencies behind them, who really need to be in your corner as we start the first steps toward a re-election campaign." And a few of them got together and they said, "Well, we've got this, the Republicans always do this Lincoln Day thing, but there's no reason why Lincoln Day has to be a Republican thing. Why don't we take over Lincoln Day?" And so on February 12th, after the GOP, all the congressmen had left Washington, they were home in their home states. Everett Dirksen was here talking about his role in his stance on civil rights. He was very, very much in support of it. Jacob Javits from New York was I believe, I think he was in Syracuse or Rochester. In any case, he was in upstate New York. He was also a very strong civil rights Republican. He was up talking about it. And as they were off on the Hastings, doing their stump speeches, Kennedy invited about 300 of the country's leading blacks to the White House. Now, this included civil rights leaders, but it also included sports figures, included musicians, actors, anybody who was prominent, broadly speaking. Invited them to the White House. And so it was a chilly day. They all lined up in their finest, the husbands and wives, and they had their invitations, or embossed, beautiful White House invitations. They're very proud to get this because nothing like this had ever happened. Of course, African Americans had been in the White House and had been invited in small groups to come meet with the president, but nothing like this had ever happened. A full reception, a full-on reception, and they were fed food from made by Jackie Kennedy's favorite French chef, and it was serenaded by the Marine Corps band, and they were all given the opportunity to have their photo taken with President Kennedy and his wife. And so it was a real honor for a lot of people. It was a brilliant move on Kennedy's part. Nothing like I said, nothing like it had never happened, and blacks knew that. And for many, it completely stole the thunder of the GOP's move, because of course these were a few hundred GOP congressmen back talking to their constituencies, most of whom were not black. I mean, even by the 1960s, of course, most African Americans still lived in the South, and certainly did not live in small towns and places where these guys were speaking. Meanwhile, the black media was all focused on what was going on in the White House. They knew this was going on, and so they were all there focused on it, reporting on it, writing for Jet Magazine, for the variety of African American newspapers that were still quite prominent back then. And at the same time, Kennedy made sure it was low key for the mainstream media. He didn't invite the mainstream media. He didn't or the white media. He didn't invite the Washington Post. He didn't invite the New York Times. He didn't tell any of his sort of white establishment friends that he was doing this. He made very carefully placed media calls to make sure that this was something that got a huge amount of attention in the black media, but got very little attention among the white establishment. One of the really sort of tragic comic events of the afternoon, of the evening, really points this up. At one point, Sammy Davis Jr., who was invited, shows up, and as some of you may remember, at the time, he was married to May Britt, who was a Swedish, obviously a white Swedish woman, actress, who, a very striking, beautiful woman, but was white. And they had, not that Sammy Davis Jr. cared, but he had gotten criticism for, being married to a white woman. And, Kennedy saw the two of them coming, and of course they wanted to meet the president and say hi, and he dodged. He sort of ran around a corner. He just sort of played tag with him all evening, trying to make sure that photographers didn't take a picture of the president with an interracial couple. Because, first of all, Sammy Davis Jr., 1963, height of his fame. So any cameraman is going to take a photo of that and put that in the paper. But an interracial couple with the president appearing, and that might make it into the New York Times or the Washington Post, or might get mentioned on TV. And at that point, the jig would be up, and Kennedy's whole balanced media play would be gone. So he dodged them and was very careful. And nevertheless, the reception in the black media was fairly positive. Most people wrote very glowingly about the event because it was a very nice event. But tellingly, there were several civil rights leaders who saw this for what it was. They were not fooled by what Kennedy was doing. Two of the most important who boycotted the event, actually, were Martin Luther King, who said, I appreciate the invitation, but there is no way I'm going to participate in this. Thank you very much. And also Clarence Mitchell, who was the head of the Washington Bureau for the NAACP, but somewhat more importantly was the head lobbyist for the NAACP, and was really just, even today, lobbyists will tell you that he was the greatest lobbyist of all time, that he was someone who knew the ins and outs of Congress like the back of his hand, but also could, on a very hot topic issue like civil rights and race, could go up to anybody in Congress and sit down and talk to them. They probably would disagree on some things. He could go talk to Richard Russell, the dean of the Southern Democrats in the Senate, an arch segregationist, and have a good conversation. The two of them would get along. And of course, each of them hated what the other represented, but Mitchell was the kind of guy who could have that conversation. Both of these men, King and Mitchell, would play integral roles, I would say, alongside Kennedy, two of the most important roles in getting the Civil Rights Bill up and running and then moving it into a stronger and stronger position over the course of 1963, and both of them sat out this event. Now, to me, the event, this Lincoln Day dinner is, I use it to introduce the book because I think it's a good way to sort of capture a lot of different things. The relationship between Kennedy and the civil rights movement, to the issue of civil rights, to the kind of person Kennedy was at the time with regards to civil rights. Most importantly, to how far he as a president had to go, because I do believe that by the time he was assassinated, he did believe not only fully in the idea of civil rights as an issue that the government needed to address, but also very fully in a civil rights bill that was as strong as possible. And that is so far from where he was on February 12th. Now, what happened was not so much that Kennedy decided to change his mind, as much as a series of events changed his mind. Starting with, I believe, the James Meredith integration crisis at Ole Miss, which was actually in the fall of 1962. This was something that Kennedy, rather naively, just couldn't believe happened. He could not believe that it took the nationalization of the Mississippi National Guard, it took U.S. Marshals, it took actually the death of a foreign reporter, of a French reporter, in the mob scene that resulted from the effort to integrate, to bring James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. Kennedy simply could not believe this happened. And he told that to his aides afterward. He said, I just cannot believe that this is what the South is willing to go to prevent an obviously qualified man from simply going to college. And that kind of set his thinking in motion, so that when things happened subsequently, like the arrest and imprisonment of Martin Luther King during his protest efforts or his integration efforts, his marches in Albany, Georgia, in late 1962. The Birmingham crisis, obviously, in the spring of 1963. The Stand in the Schoolhouse Door by George Wallace at the University of Alabama in 1963, and of course the assassination of Medgar Evers, the very night that George Wallace stood down and allowed the integration of the University of Alabama. These things added up to a very persuasive case for Kennedy that something had to be done, that the South, which he always believed would just come around eventually. He had this kind of old school Whiggish kind of belief that the South has some smart people, they will eventually bring the kind of retrograde element around, and there will be progress. And all of these incidents added up to a convincing case for Kennedy that was not enough. So on the evening of June 11th, 1963, that was the day that George Wallace backed down in Tuscaloosa, and it was just a few hours after that, actually, and a few hours before Medgar Evers was assassinated in Jackson, Mississippi. Kennedy went on national TV to deliver a speech about civil rights, and it was more or less an extemporaneous decision. It was something he had sort of been throwing around in his mind had the Alabama crisis not turned out peacefully. He had been planning to give a speech to kind of justify whatever actions he decided to take. But when it turned peaceful, when it resulted peacefully, and when Wallace stood down, he said, no, you know what, I want to talk about civil rights anyway. I want to go on TV and talk. So he called up all three television networks. Back then it was a little easier to get everyone's attention. He called them up and said, I want 30 minutes. And they all said, oh, yeah, okay. He set his speechwriters rapidly, just said, go, write. You have 2 hours. Write a speech. Here's what I want you to say. They're writing in one room. His advisors are coming up with notes in the other room. They're cobbling things together. And eventually Kennedy walked in and said, I've got 5 minutes. Just give me whatever you have. So he takes whatever he has. He has just a bunch of notes, a half-written speech, and he sits in front of the TV. And by the way, if you want to see this or hear it, it's online. You can see it on YouTube or listen to it on YouTube. It was a heck of a speech. It was really one of his greatest speeches. And partly because it was largely extemporaneous. We all know Kennedy was a great speaker. Oftentimes when it came to civil rights, he could be very by the book and would just kind of read from his notes and not really say what he felt because he didn't really feel anything. And it was very different that night. Kennedy said, most notably, we are confronted primarily with a moral issue. He said, it is as old as the scripture and it is clear as the American Constitution. Kennedy had very clearly been listening to King. He knew what King had been saying. He was always wary of meeting with King, but he was listening to what the man was saying. He knew his speeches. And this speech, particularly the extemporaneous parts, are filled with subtle references to King, as well as subtle references to Lincoln. And Kennedy was a student of history. He wrote Profiles in Courage. He knew a bit about American history, and he knew the resonance of being the president 100 years after Lincoln. And so much of his speech is filled with this historical understanding that here we are in 1963, 100 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, and we're not much further along than where Lincoln left us. In some ways, we're behind, frankly, than where we were when the Civil War ended. And he knew that. And so much of the story of that first 6 months of 1963 is his coming around to the awareness of what all that meant and the necessity for him to commit fully to action, not for political reasons, because this was still a very politically risky move. He still had to deal with the fact that his Southern Democratic allies were not going to be very happy. And in fact, they weren't. The very next day, even before he issued any kind of legislation, the very next day, the Southern Democrats had a meeting, and Strom Thurmond said, let's bolt now. Let's tell him that we're not going to support any legislation, no matter what it is, foreign policy, anything, unless he rescinds that speech. And God forbid he should issue legislation. Now, some of the other Southern Democrats said, yeah, we can work with this, we can see where we're going. But several of them were already ready to toss Kennedy into the fire. And Kennedy knew this was a risk. He knew what was confronting him. But nevertheless, he went forward. And about a week later, he introduced the Civil Rights Bill. Now, by June 11th, when he gave that speech, he had already had his brother, Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, head of the Department of Justice. He had already had him and his team writing the legislation. They pretty much had it in the bag by June 11th. They weren't releasing it. He wasn't talking about it. But they were already ready to issue the legislation. Now, when the bill came out, it wasn't quite everything the civil rights movement had wanted. It did include more or less what it ended up being a signal part of the legislation as it was signed, a ban on public discrimination in most parts of the private sector. Let's say hotels, restaurants, the things that the movement in the South had agitated most for access to. Also, public facilities, parks, swimming pools, tennis courts, things that were public amenities, and yet in the South, and even in a lot of the border states, were explicitly off limits to African Americans, and in much of the rest of the country were implicitly off limits. This not only created a federal stance on that, but also gave the Attorney General power to go in and carry suits forward. What the bill didn't include was power for the Attorney General to go in and intervene in any civil rights case, any violation of rights in the South. That was one of the main demands of the movement, and of course that never quite made it into the bill. But the other thing that people wanted was major legislation, a major effort on job discrimination. This was always going to be a tricky issue because job discrimination was not solely an issue in the South. In some ways, it was even more of an issue in the North because there you had jobs that were ostensibly open to African Americans. You had educated African Americans, a much larger population in the South, people who said, well, I have a college degree. Why can I only get a job as a janitor? This is ridiculous. And Howard graduates who could only get jobs as postal clerks. And yet, for a variety of reasons, they were prevented from taking those jobs. So this was something that would strike directly at the more, let's say, complex forms of discrimination around the country, not just things like Jim Crow in the South that everybody outside the South was very happy to target. So Kennedy was a little wary of approaching that question. And the civil rights movement said, okay, well, here's this bill. Now we're going to push you very, very hard. In fact, there's one instance where the United Auto Workers and the AFL-CIO, which were very much in support of the movement and support of the bill, and often they paid for the March on Washington, they paid for bail funds for civil rights workers in the South. They put together, their legal team put together a document that criticized the Civil Rights Bill and said, we're not going to support it unless it has this, this, and this, and sent it to Kennedy. Kennedy was apoplectic. He called in one of their representatives and said, I can't believe you wrote this. Don't you know that I'm already risking everything? And they said, yeah, but we think you can risk more. We think you can do a little more. And so they continued to push him. And over the next 5 months, between the issuing of the legislation and Kennedy's assassination, the story is very much about how Kennedy, the movement, the Democrats, the Republicans, maneuvered around each other to get a bill that everyone could agree on. And rather than being a passive participant in this operation, which is often the way that Kennedy is portrayed, I think that I would argue that he played a very active role as someone who said, you have to convince me, but I'm willing to be convinced to take the risk to make this legislation even stronger than it already is. What I think is laudatory is that Kennedy was convinced, and that as he saw public opinion and grassroots activism come out so strongly in favor of a bill and in favor of a stronger bill, he was willing to say, okay, I will turn and I will start to support these parts of the bill that I had said I wouldn't in the first place. One of the things that's most telling is his position on the March on Washington as sort of a proxy for where he stood on civil rights. He was very much against the idea of a March on Washington when it was first proposed. He thought that it would risk the bill. He thought that it would bring far too much attention to the process in Washington. Frankly, he was afraid that there would be violence, whether it was police violence or whether it was a riot. Don't forget, keep in mind, some of you may be old enough to remember, even something like Birmingham, which was very clearly an issue of, a situation where the police set on peaceful black protesters, was often perceived by whites around the country as kind of the fault of the protesters, or at least there was that suspicion. And people were very afraid of the March on Washington. They were very afraid that there would be riots, that there would be violence, and Kennedy along with them. The city cleared out largely of white people during on that day of the march on August 28th. The baseball game, the Senators were playing the Brewers. That game was canceled. Army soldiers that were positioned around the Capitol were put on alert, and police were brought in from cities like Baltimore and Philadelphia, around the country, around that part of the country, to reinforce the Metropolitan Police in D.C. because they were afraid of what would happen. Now, of course, that's the opposite of what happened. The March on Washington was, not only was it much larger than anyone expected, it was 250,000 people, but it was the most peaceful expression of support for racial justice and biracial, multiracial. It was obviously, if you've seen the photographs, it's obviously mostly African American, but a large number of whites, a large number of Hispanics showed up in support of civil rights. And not just civil rights, but also economic rights. And people often forget that the march was the March on Washington for freedom and justice, or freedom and jobs. People were aggravated that not only were rights being denied in the South, but that economic justice was being denied around the country. And the list of speakers addressed all of that leading up to Martin Luther King's speech. Nevertheless, Kennedy and the leaders, the speakers that day wanted to meet with Kennedy beforehand to sit down with him and say, well, let's talk about the legislation, let's talk about the march that we're doing. And he said no. Even once he came around and decided to support the march, more or less because it was a fait accompli, it was going to happen. He said, no, I don't really want to, let's meet afterward. He was worried that something might happen. The march changed him. Afterward, when they did come to the White House, and you had A. Philip Randolph, who was the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the largest black union in the country, Martin Luther King, as well as Joaquin Prince, who was the head of the American Jewish Congress. You had Walter Reuther, who was the head of the UAW, United Auto Workers. This biracial group of civil rights leaders came to the White House, and Kennedy greeted them. He had listened to everything. He said, "I have a dream." He was so excited about Kennedy's speech, about King's speech. He knew that this was a great historical speech, and he was so jazzed that, wow, this, not only was it a peaceful march, but it was this great list of speakers topped by this amazing speech. And he was won over. I mean, in the same way that the march won over so many millions of Americans who saw it on TV and said, okay, this is what civil rights is about. It's not about violence. It's not about disorder. It's about a quarter of a million people marching in the street peacefully for their rights. And Kennedy was right there on board with it. And that conversation that afternoon, rather than being what probably they would have talked about in the morning, which was, how are we going to manage this? It was, okay, how are we going to get this bill, or an even stronger version, through the House, through the Senate, and to my desk? Kennedy was fully on board. And don't forget, of course, just another Lincoln tie-in, that King began his speech with an explicit reference to the Gettysburg Address. He said, 50 years ago, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. Lincoln stood over all of this, both from the White House and from the Civil Rights Movement. They were all aware of what they were talking about that day. 2 weeks later, not even 2 weeks later, tragedy struck. A crime, a heinous crime. 4 girls were killed when a bomb was set off on Sunday morning at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham. The bomb was intended to kill a lot more people. It was not aimed at the 4 girls, but they were the ones who were killed. And it struck the nation. It shocked everybody that here we are, we're celebrating this great March on Washington. We're all feeling this warmth, and then the worst thing that you could possibly imagine happened. One of the silver linings of that was in Congress. Immediately, the tragedy, the event gave momentum to liberals, to people who supported the bill, and liberals in both parties, to come forward and to start juicing up the bill, start adding amendments, saying, look, we put this bill forward in the first place because of Birmingham, because of medgravers, because of what we saw in the spring. Now we have evidence. It's even more urgent that we do something. So let's add an EEOC, an Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Let's add legislation that gives the Attorney General real power to go into the South and attack discrimination at its roots. Let's make every part of this bill stronger, as strong as we can possibly get it. And it was. And they added these amendments in the Judiciary Committee, and it was voted on in a subcommittee, and then went up to the Judiciary Committee. Now, Kennedy wasn't entirely happy with this. He felt that it was loading the bill up with so much that it might not pass the House, and certainly would not survive a filibuster in the Senate. But it's very important to note that Kennedy, rather than push back and say, well, I'm simply not going to accept any of these additions, I'm going to go with what I wrote, my bill, I want my bill, which he very well could have done. Another politician probably would have done. He nevertheless worked assiduously, brilliantly, and without end of effort to reach a compromise between the two factions, the various factions in the two parties, to craft a draft of the bill that was much stronger than what he had introduced, but was nevertheless tweaked in a way that everyone could be happy that it would be something that he could eventually sign, that, by meaning that would survive the House, would survive the Senate, and that would get to his bill, get to his desk, and that he could sign as soon as possible. So, thanks to his effort, the bill made it out of the House Judiciary Committee. The various parties could all agree to it. And made it into the Rules Committee, where it faced another challenge. The head of the Rules Committee was a guy named Howard Smith, who was a hardcore Virginia segregationist. And that's where it sat on November 22nd, 1963, when Kennedy was assassinated. 5 days later, the slain president's successor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, rose to address a joint session of Congress. It was his first speech, his first real public statement after Kennedy's assassination. Millions of Americans watched on TV. The entire country was watching. Johnson began his speech by saying, "No memorial oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill, for which he fought so long." Now, Johnson was obviously being strategic. He wanted the bill. Johnson was a strong supporter of the bill. And he knew that by attaching Kennedy's name to it, whatever you might think of Kennedy's role on the bill, by attaching Kennedy's name to it, you would immediately give it a power that was very hard to fight against. But he was also being very sincere. The bill was Kennedy's signal legacy, the legacy that defined him as a president who responded to the public, a president who adjusted and risked his agenda to promote racial justice. It was indeed Kennedy's shining memorial. And with that, I thank you very much for having me here, and I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have.